Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Q&A webinar with me, Duncan Crawford, where we're going to be discussing the results from the brand new OECD survey of adult skills. Apologies for the slightly late start to this Q&A session. The survey, of course, was released this morning, just a few hours ago. It assesses the literacy, numeracy, and problem-solving skills of adults in 31 countries and economies, including 27 who participated in this survey a decade ago. So we have a pretty good idea about where adults are performing well and where they are underperforming. The purpose of this session is to have a presentation of the main findings, and then you will have the opportunity to ask questions. Please use the chat function at the bottom of your screens, write in your questions, and I will try to get through as many of those questions as possible. First, though, to kick things off, we're going to get an update on the main findings and data from this report by the OECD's Director for Education and Skills, Andreas Schleicher. Andreas, over to you.
Good. Once again, this is a very important day. We launched our once in 10 years survey that looks and measures what adults can do in reading, in mathematics, in problem solving. We do that only every 10 years because it's an incredibly complex undertaking. We surveyed over 160,000 adults, going to their households, giving them a test and collecting lots of contextual data in 31 countries. An incredible, and the only direct assessment of skills. We have lots of information about formal qualifications and degrees that people have, but actually it's the first time that we have direct information on their skills. I already mentioned the areas that we looked at. We looked at literacy, we looked at numeracy, we looked at adaptive problem solving. So let me start with what adults can actually do. Here you can see the list of the countries that are ranked by their performance on the literacy test, the capacity to access, understand, evaluate, and reflect on written text. You can see countries in Northern Europe and Japan coming out on top. In the middle, you find countries like Germany, Ireland, Czechia, New Zealand, or the United States. And towards the lower end, you see Israel, Lithuania, Poland, Portugal, and Chile. What's concerning is the very large, often very large share of people without foundational literacy who perform at or below level 1. Who can read just, very simple text. To give you a sense of that, here's a short text on preschool rules. It starts with, please have your child here by 9 a.m. and then it gives some further advice. And the question that people had to get right was simply, what is the latest time that children should arrive? And that's the kind of reading skill you would expect from a 10-year-old child in an advanced kind of countries. And as you can see here in Chile, over half of adults don't get beyond that level 1. Even in, top performers, Finland or Japan, it's still 1 in 10 adults that have or don't have, foundational literacy. You might say there's always going to be some job for those, but, think also about social participation, about civic participation. In some countries, you can't even buy a bus ticket without those level 1 foundational skills. Not to speak about, distinguishing, fact from fake news. At the other end of the spectrum, you find readers with at least foundational and often good literacy, at level 4, marked here in yellow. People can read dense text across multiple pages, and they can infer what a task is asking, based on complex or implicit statements. And that's about literacy. I already said we also looked at numeracy, but as you would expect, countries that do well in literacy tend to do also well in numeracy. You find just a few exceptions. For example, Singaporeans do better in numeracy than in literacy, while Americans do better on literacy and perform below average in numeracy. Unsurprisingly, adults with more highly educated parents, here marked by the green triangle, do better, but the social gap actually varies quite a lot across countries. Look how large social disparities are in Germany and how small they are in Spain. And those differences show us that public policy can make a difference. You can see actually those kinds of social disparities are not, uniform across countries, but actually in some countries, even adults from more disadvantaged backgrounds have quite good literacy skills. So poverty need not be destiny. As I mentioned, we did that survey already a decade ago, so we can see how things have changed since then. And in literacy, only Finland and Denmark have seen measurable improvement since 2012. At the same time, you see a whole group of countries with declines, sometimes sharp declines. Some countries did the first assessment in 2015 or 17. Also here you see a clear downward trend. Now, in some countries, the composition of the population has changed over the last decade, for example, in terms of age or immigrant background. And when you account for that, look at the green diamond in this chart. You can see, for example, that in Sweden or Norway or Korea, that actually makes quite a big difference. But in most countries, the changes that we see here are real. They're not just an artifact of changes in populations or immigration. So including that downward trend, it's not something you can explain away with more people having an immigrant background or population aging or things like this. And actually, here's part of the explanation. The decline in literacy has been mainly driven by more people doing poorly. The blue bar here shows you the share of people not getting beyond level 1 in the earlier assessment. And when you compare that with the share of low performers from our latest assessment last year in 23, here in green, you can see how the share of low performers has grown in many countries, and in some very. Yes, I'm really sorry. I have a really bad internet connection here. Now, just wanted to say, the share of low performers in reading and literacy being on the rise, whereas on the top end of the distributions have been quite stable. So in a nutshell, we've seen a polarization of skills in many countries. Now, and of course, that polarization of skills in our populations then drives the polarization that you see in economic and social outcomes, but also civic outcomes. I'm going to talk about that in a moment now. In half of the countries, we've also seen the socioeconomic literacy gap increase, and in some countries significantly. You can see here in Estonia, in Austria, or Germany. And even after accounting for immigrant background and demographics, you see significant increases in social disparities, now marked here by the green diamond. So our society is actually polarizing also more on the socioeconomic spectrum. Here you see the results in terms of skill differences between the 10% top and bottom performers in countries like the US, Singapore, New Zealand, Germany, or Israel. The performance gap in literacy is particularly large, while in the Slovak Republic, performance varies much less. And the picture is quite similar in numeracy. Talking about numeracy, changes in numeracy have overall been more favorable. You can see as many countries with improvements as there have been declines over the last decade. Now, and what that shows is that you can't say that adults have generally become less skilled, but we have clearly become worse readers than we used to be a decade ago. And perhaps that's also a reflection on what and how we read in the digital world these days. If we look at trends over the long run, you can see that youth have much higher literacy skills than older generations, whose performance you can see here in the purple square now. And that's not so much a surprise. Those who enter the labor market had much better educational opportunities than those who leave for retirement, obviously. But what is striking is how much those Look here once more at the United States. You know, the older generation has better literacy skills than you see in many countries, and certainly at the OECD average. But when you look at the literacy skills of young Americans, they fall clearly behind the OECD average. That's because so many other countries have been so much faster in progressing across successive generations. England also is a country with limited generational progress. But then you look at Singapore. You know, the older generation in Singapore performs much worse than their peers in the US, but young Singaporeans do much better than the American peers, simply because school and other educational experiences in Singapore have improved so rapidly. Now, in Korea tells a similar story. Let me also point to Chile. You know, you saw they got the last place in the overall ranking, but you can see the young population is catching up and doing much better than older Chileans. And if you look at this more closely, you can see how Singapore rose from, 25th place among older adults to 5th place among the youth. Estonia from the 29th to the 15th place, and Korea from the 16th to the 4th place. And on the other hand, you had New Zealand dropping from 5th to 22nd, the Slovak Republic from 6th to 19th, and the US from 10th to 20th in the young population. And these numbers have huge implications, for the future. Youth are only a small percentage of the population, but they're 100% of the future economy, of the future society of every country. When you look at the age group in the middle here in light blue, you can see some interesting nuance. There's a group of countries where adults keep building literacy skills even after school, as they grow older. Look at, Finland, Estonia, Flanders, Denmark, New Zealand, England, where 25 to 34-year-olds outperform 16 or 24-year-olds. So they keep building their skills after formal education. But you don't see that in so many places. Upskilling and reskilling later in life is still more the exception than the rule. Let me look at STEM for a moment. Here you see the share of tertiary graduates who studied in a STEM field. And as you can see, science, math, engineering, technology are popular in Singapore, in Germany, in Austria, Korea, Czechia, much less so in Japan and the Netherlands. Interestingly, we see women are underrepresented among STEM graduates. Maybe less so in Portugal, but certainly in Japan, where women comprise less than 15% of the STEM graduates. But as you can see, numeracy skills among STEM graduates tend to be higher than the numeracy skills from other fields. Now, to some extent, that's what you would expect, given that math is always an important subject in most STEM-related studies. But it's not all of the story. What is striking that is among STEM graduates, men score significantly higher in numeracy than women. It's not true in all countries. So, for example, in Korea, female STEM graduates actually have higher numeracy scores. And that gap remains visible even after adjusting for demographics. Let's have a look at education. Education is an obvious source of skills. So, unsurprisingly, people with advanced qualifications, think of a university degree or equivalent vocational qualification, do generally well on the survey of adult skills. But look at how widely the skills of universities graduates differ across countries. Now, you can't say, a graduate has the same literacy skills all around the world. Actually, in some countries, university graduates have high levels of literacy skills, and other people, even though they got a degree, only doing so. Of course, everywhere college graduates do much better than adults who only completed high school or not even that. But again, that educational gap varies hugely across countries. You can see how Finnish high school graduates have similar or better literacy skills than college graduates in most other countries. And you can see a similar dispersion of skill levels among degree holders also inside each country. So a degree only tells you so much about the skills that people actually have. And it shows you one of the most fundamental problems in modern economies. We often value people by some paper certificate, where they have studied, how long they have studied. But when you actually look at the skills people actually have, you could get a very, very different picture. And our economies, our societies need to become much, much better to recognize what people know and can do rather than just where they study. I told you, I mentioned social disparities are large. Gender differences are generally not as large as you might think. In numeracy, men tend to do better, and even more so when you adjust for demographics in education. In problem solving, men also have a slight advantage, but it's only really visible in 10 countries. And you talk about, 5 points or so at most. So that's not really a big difference. And then in literacy, it goes the other way around. Women tend to have an advantage. And I'm telling you this because, different from a decade ago, it's different. Because a decade ago, men still had a slight advantage in literacy. But over the last decade, men have dropped in their literacy skills more so than women. And so it has flipped the other way around. Finally, immigration. It's clearly another factor. In most countries, foreign-born adults score markedly lower than native-born adults. But importantly, that difference shrinks sometimes to less than half when you account for education, for demographics, for social background, marked here in green diamond. I just wanted to show you how some of the skill changes have been driven. You can see here, for example, in England, skill improvements have been largely driven by the young population. Now, they have seen big improvements. Now, changes for older adults have not been really significant. In Sweden and other Nordic countries, it's the other way around. It's the older generation that has improved their skills, lifelong learning, better established. And in New Zealand, the drop was driven by a decline in the youth population. So different age groups actually driving the changes that we observe. And I want to commend in particular the Nordic countries because in aging demographies, upskilling and reskilling will be increasingly important. In economies that are changing rapidly, upskilling and reskilling will be increasingly important. And those countries actually show us the way. They're very modular in their learning. They're very good in recognizing the skills of people. They're very good in integrating working and learning. And you can see that here in the results. In education, most countries have seen significant rises in education attainment, marked here by the blue bar. And since higher levels of education are associated with better skills, better education is driven performance improvement. But as you saw earlier, most countries have also seen a decline in the skills of the poorly educated, some even among university educated people. And that has sometimes more than offset the increase in the number. So basically, in some countries, we've seen an inflation in the labor market value or the outcomes of degrees and qualifications. More people getting, certificates, but not necessarily improving their skills. The increase in immigrant populations had a small negative effect in most countries. You see the dark blue bar here. In some countries, look at Germany, Austria, Singapore, or New Zealand. We've also seen a marked decline in literacy skills among immigrants relative to the native population. But even if you look at that, take it together, the effects are just around 5 points, which is just 10% of a standard deviation. So you cannot explain the overall declines in literacy that we have seen with a rise in the immigration alone. Now, let me, conclude with a snapshot on the outcomes of investment in skills. Now, the first thing that we can clearly see is that skills matter for employment. Now, education matters for employment. And I look here both at the years of education in green, at the numeracy skills in blue, and you can see both have an impact. And sometimes formal qualifications matter more. In others, it's the numeracy skills that have a greater impact on employment. We look at wages. Now you can see here the effect of one standard deviation increase in years of education and numeracy skills. And you take, for example, the example of France. Years of education don't matter that much. Employers do not pay that much attention on, how long you've studied, but actually numeracy skills have a very significant impact on the wage of people. No? And Singapore, country next on the list here, it's the other way around. Numeracy skills matter a lot, but education matters even more. So there are different kind of combinations, but clearly both what you know and your formal qualifications have a huge impact on the salaries that you will get. Now, in fact, when you look at what explains the variation in wages, you can see numeracy proficiency, quite an important factor, 5–10% of variation explained by that. Then education added to that. There's a lot more in education than numeracy. And then, what you study, if you study, STEM fields, probably is going to make more of a difference for your wage than if you study, something that is not so much in demand in labor market. Then how long you've been in your job, and finally, individual characteristics. But if you look at this overall picture, you can see very clearly how important, skills proficiency in education are in explaining wages. What we find also really interesting is when you compare that, 10 years ago and now, in most countries, you can see the red bar being longer than the green and blue bars. In other words, the impact that education and skills have on your wage has grown in the last decade. So that's something, we should take to heart, that our labor markets become less forgiving to actually poor skills. Now, if you have good education, great skills, you get better and better wages. If you struggle with your education and your skills, you face growing wage penalties. Now that polarization is a really, really important phenomenon that we can observe, and that has clearly grown over the last decade. We also see that it doesn't end with money. You can see good skills are linked also with you being happy with your life. That relationship is not equal across countries. In some countries, you see very strong relationships, others less so. But overall, you can clearly see how skills matter, not just economically, but also socially. We also see the same with health. No? You never know what's cause and effect. Most likely, people with poor skills also get the kind of jobs that are less healthy and so on. And so there may be many things going on, but clearly there is a relationship not just with economic outcomes, but also with social outcomes. Political efficacy is sort of an interesting, finding here. In some countries, you can say people with better skills feel more confident in our democracies. They feel that they have more of a voice. But there are also countries, you look at Poland, at Spain, at Hungary, where the highly skilled seem to be, feeling less of a sense of political efficacy. And we need to better understand those relationships, because political efficacy is an incredibly important part. Do you feel an active part of your society? You feel that you can make a difference. You feel some sense of agency, and you can see skills do matter, but not always in the same direction. And last but not least, trust is also very clearly associated with skills, even more so than political efficacy. Do you have confidence, trust in other people around you? Now, that clearly depends on how well you can access society's resources, how well you can understand things. So a very, very important relationships. And last but not least, also in volunteering. Now, what our data also show is that the qualifications people have are not always well matched to the jobs that they have. Now, here you can see the share of workers who say they're overqualified, they have better qualifications than what they need to enter that job. And you can see the share of workers who are underqualified. And you can see, in England, Japan, Israel, New Zealand, overqualification is a big issue. You can say, well, it doesn't matter. It's better to have more skills than less skills. But actually, it makes a difference. It makes, and I'm going to see that later. It is you pay a price for that. If you have a job that is underutilizing your skills, you're not going to get as much money as someone who their skills would be well used. So our labor markets could become better in extracting value from the skills, making sure that people work in the place where they can use their skills really best. And that problem is particularly pronounced among foreign workers, not surprisingly. Often it's hard to recognize, the value of their skills. You have, someone with an immigrant background may be highly qualified in their country, but the country of destination may not be able to recognize their skills, their qualifications. It's not a surprise, but it's in a way a shame. Again, it shows that our economies are not really good in utilizing or good enough in utilizing the potential that people bring with them. Interestingly, it's not just formal qualifications. We also see that when we look at the skills of people, there's a fair amount of overskilling. That is, people have skills that they're currently not fully deploying at the workforce. So there is a workplace. So there is a significant potential, again, also here for our economies, our society, to make better use of talent, which is clearly important and scarce resource. And then, last but not least, some workers also say that they work in a field that is different from what they studied, and that again can lead to some efficiency. And you can see here, overqualified workers typically face a wage penalty, not surprisingly. They basically cannot put their skills to use. They're not going to get paid for them. And you can see that effect varies across countries, but it is clearly visible. Yeah, the last point I really want to make is that workers who are overqualified also not only get less money, but they're also less happy with their life. Clearly, they feel, that they could make a bigger contribution than they currently do. And all of that suggests, we obviously need to provide people with better skills, but we should also become better in making good use of the skills that people have. And that's really all I wanted to share, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Andreas. That was different to other presentations we've had in the past. So we've made it to the end, though. So thank you to everyone for staying with us as well. And now we can take your questions. So please, if you have any questions, please write them in now. Now's your chance to ask whatever you'd like to Andreas about the survey's findings. To kick things off, lots of people have been asking Andreas about why literacy has declined more than numeracy. Or in Estonia, for example, asks, how do you explain the larger decline in literacy than numeracy? Could testing and whether you use tablets, for example, play a role, she asks.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting, finding that if we had seen a similar increase in numeracy, we would have said, probably overall skills have declined. But the fact that it was only literacy really suggests there's something going on here. I mean, for a start, I would say probably our reading habits are quite different now. In the past, if you think about, media articles, in the past, they used to be more complex. You read longer text. You read text with multiple viewpoints, opinions. You had a contrast, critique. Today, we read more snippets and bullets in the digital world. Often, what we read is amplifying our own perspectives. We are embracing this kind of echo chambers. And so I do think those kinds of things probably had an effect. How we read in the digital world probably had an effect on to what extent we can read complex text, get to levels 4 and 5, where you need to navigate ambiguity, integrate multiple sources, distinguish fact from opinion. But, it may be an explanation, it's an hypothesis only, but it's still a worry, because what the digital world really requires from people is to accelerate the advancement of the skills. And if we see the opposite, we should be concerned.
And a question here from James Michael Walker, Andreas, who says, the US is relatively good in literacy and weak in numeracy. How can you explain the case of the US?
It's actually something that we have seen over the years already. We can see that even in the young population. If you look at 15-year-olds in the PISA comparisons, the US actually does quite well in literacy and actually struggles with numeracy. It comes out well below the OECD average. So it's not so much a surprise. It's something that we have seen. The foundations in school that are late in school in numeracy in the US are quite weak. So that's clearly a point to take away from here. It's not something that we can attribute to the adult population. It's something that has a clear historical kind of pattern.
Okay, very interesting. Please do keep sending your questions in. Here's another one for Andreas from Fabio Roma from Italy, surprise, surprise, who is a question about policymakers and how to best influence policymakers. He asks, what's the best way for policymakers to use the survey for adult skills, the data from it?
I think there's several ways. I mean, first of all, it gives you kind of a sense of what the stock of skills is in your population and how well your economy is making use of the skills. So I think that's, for a start, a really, really important baseline that policymakers get. You do not get that from, national qualifications. But the more interesting uses come from, comparing yourself. Whatever challenge you have in your country, you'll find countries on this survey that have mastered those challenges. And the fact that, some issues like poor performance among certain groups have been successfully addressed in other countries really helps us to look upwards for policies and practices. The fact that lifelong and lifelong learning have become pretty much a reality in the Nordic countries of Europe, while, Southern Europe and North America are quite far away from that, really shows us that there's a lot of scope for learning from other systems. Now, that doesn't mean that you can copy and paste policy solutions, but you can ask yourself, what are the drivers of success in different systems and how can we configure them in our own country? So peer learning, peer collaboration, particularly in a field like adult skills that actually many countries grapple with. We have seen huge efforts in many countries to, improve the upskilling, reskilling, all of that. But, only a few countries have changed the needle, and we can and should learn from them.
Thank you so much for that. And that actually has answered a question, which Arthur McKee, I'm not going to read it out, but I think your question was answered by what Andreas just said there. Here's another question for you from Ollie Lucas, who asks, is the decline in adult literacy linked to learning poverty among the younger population who have aged?
I don't think you can say that generally. There are clearly some countries in which younger populations show a drop in literacy outcomes, but there are other countries where the drop has mainly been driven by older people becoming less skilled. So I don't think we can, there are really different patterns visible. What is more universal is that the share of low performers, whether old or young, has increased in many countries. That's something, we have seen enlargement of the bottom end of the distribution, but you cannot associate it with specific age groups or young people necessarily.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask you a question where you have touched on this already, really, but Potter in Poland asks, why are some countries performing so badly? What's setting them apart from high performers? And can you pinpoint what it is? Is it investment? Is it policies? Is it curriculum or something else, they ask?
Yeah, to some extent, you can see that in the history of education, at countries that have a strong and equitable education history. You look at Finland, you look at Denmark, they had, for generations, a very strong kind of education systems, and that plays off in a highly skilled adult population. Other countries are more recently on that track. To some extent, that is an important factor. But also the incidence and intensity of adult learning. Now, what opportunities do adults have to upgrade their skills? Now, to what extent is learning and working well intertwined in countries? So I think there are many factors that play into those kinds of results. The third part, often forgotten is how well our, workplaces utilize the skills of people. Now, skills that you do not use, you will lose. And you can see that sometimes, when you try to do the mathematics homework with your children, in middle school, you begin to struggle. And we knew a lot of things, and we lose them because we didn't use those kinds of skills. And workplaces that are more literacy intensive are clearly better in maintaining and advancing the skill potential of people. So you need to look at all of those things together.
Okay, so possibly in Poland, I hope that answers your question. Here's a question for you, Andreas, which is about the test itself. Does the survey of adult skills consider the rigor and attitudes of people who take the test? They write that there may be discrepancies in how the test is taken in different countries. That's what they're asking about. Yeah,
that's a very legitimate comment. And in fact, we have trained our interviewers to, support adults in responding to the test. I mean, if it had been purely an online assessment, I would have been very concerned about it. But since this was delivered by interviewers, they made their very best effort to motivate people to take this serious. That being said, in the response pattern, we see some adults in almost any country who did not make their best effort in this, who didn't answer all questions or, skipped some and so on. So yes, there are some of those patterns, and probably that's also true in everyday working life. Some people are more conscientious about what they do and others less so, and that's reflected in those kinds of tests. It's not something that we can see, differing vastly across countries. It's more that in every country, we have a certain group of respondents where we see what we call unusual response pattern. And we looked at that very carefully. In some countries, we estimated their performance based on some background data and so on. But it is something that certainly, how serious do people take any task in life, whether it's a test or something, does make a difference in how well they perform.
Staying on this kind of topic, Eva Takova has just sent in a question which is related to what you've just been saying, can you please share more on the methodology of the survey and who were actually the respondents and how have they been chosen?
Yeah, that's an important point. We took a random sample of adults. This has been actually a big part of the effort to ensure that the sample of adults is fully representative of the population, about 5,000-6,000 in every country. And this was a household survey. So once a sample had been randomly selected, we trained interviewers who went to households and administered the test about 1 hour. Some adults took longer. We did not make this a time test. Basically, people could take as long as they wanted. And then also we asked them a question, but it was interview administered on a random sample of households. That's the principles of the methodology. It's actually, if you look at the reader's guide in the report, you'll find a lot more detail in this. And there's a full technical report also explaining all of that.
Thank you for that response, Andreas. And here's another question for you from Patrice de Brucker, who's asking about overskilling and overqualification. He says, overskilling and overqualification remain a significant issue. Do you think this has to do more with the labour market institutional settings or with a somewhat misadjustment of education production?
Yeah, both factors could be applied. When you look at the education production, are we good enough in telling young people, what the labor market opportunities of certain studies are or not? Now, I think there's certainly things that we could do to give young people a more realistic appreciation of different educational pathways to ensure that they study things that actually, have a bearance on economic, on social outcomes. But there's also things going on the labor market. First of all, there is change in labor demand. New jobs are created, others are disappearing, and so some degree of mismatch is only a healthy sign of an evolving economy. Now that basically people, move on in their lives. But there are clear signs that some countries have too rigid, too siloed labor markets that do not get people to the place where they can use their skills best. You look at the two biggest economies, the United States and Japan. Now you can see Japan, top of the list when it comes to the development of skills, a very highly skilled adult population, but the labor market is quite silent, quite rigid, quite gender biased. So in the end, you have lots of people who will not make good use of the skills. And you could see that in this data, the skill mismatch. You look at the United States, there the problem is the other way around. The skill supply is quite patchy, large disparities, but the labor market is pretty good in extracting value from the skills that people have. So we need to get both things right, ensure that people develop the right skills and give people good guidance on that, and at the same time making sure that we make the best out of every person's talents, and that things like social background or immigration background or gender do not interfere with that.
Thank you very much there, Andreas. I hope that answered the questioner's question. Another one for you now from Satya Brink, who says, would you consider extending the sample to older groups, say 75 or even 85 years old? This would be important for the consumer and service economy sectors.
Absolutely right. And actually, some countries have done that. We're going to analyze those data separately. Absolutely, that's what we recommended as well. It's harder in some cases not to administer this kinds of tablet-based tests to older generations, but very important. They are in many countries a growing population group, and certainly also there, our economies should not lose that kind of skill potential. Very legitimate point.
A question about the pandemic for you from Aviana Bulgarelli, who asks, is there any association between the declines in literacy and the shutdowns during the COVID-19 period among countries?
Yeah, COVID could have impacted on any of this, both in terms of response behavior, in terms of outcomes, and so on. But if that would be a big driver, you would have seen the same effect in numeracy. There's no real explanation why this is disproportionately, the trend is disproportionate in literacy. And I would rather say, COVID has been more conducive to literacy. We may have read more during into those years than engaging with numbers. So I would say, yeah, COVID may have played a role, but I don't think, it explains the decline in literacy.
Okay, we're close to running out of time here. So last chance for people to send in their questions. Here's another one for you from James Walker, who says there's a decline of numeracy almost everywhere. There's also a decline of the preference for STEM education by student age population in many places. Why do you think that is? Is it linked?
On the first, we have seen as many countries with improvements in numeracy than we have declines. So I think that's not, numeracy has been more stable than literacy. But, if we look at the younger populations in school, the point is absolutely pertinent. We see a declining interest in STEM subjects, and the kind of, career aspirations, it's very clearly visible that many young people, even if they have good STEM skills, do not aspire to those kinds of careers. So there's a lot we need to do to ensure that, labor demand, which is very high. And I would say it's not just even labor demand, it's social demand. If you want to make a difference in today's societies, you need to have a fair degree of STEM knowledge. Things like climate change, all of those require actually a fair amount of STEM skills. So I do think we need to do a better job to develop STEM skills and actually also make sure that people pursue those as careers, that they see STEM not only as a school subject, but as something that opens life opportunities.
Related to this somewhat, Satya Brink has just sent in a question asking, can the transition to sustainable economies have contributed to the mismatch between skills and jobs?
I could not see that connection. So it's not so obvious to me. I think of course, if our economies advance very fast, from brown jobs to green jobs, that creates at least temporary mismatch. But, that alone, I don't think is the driving factor that we see here. Okay. And then again, as economies advance and develop, that temporary mismatch is always a sign of an evolving economy. The question is just, whether people and economies adapt in, matching people with the jobs.
Two final quick ones for you, Andreas. The first one, do you think technology is helping or hindering the development of people's skills, given that we have seen declines in many areas?
That's a really good and really tough question. On the one hand, technology opens up incredible opportunities for learning. Now anybody can learn anywhere. The resources that we have for upskilling and reskilling have really become incredible, both in quantity and quality. So I think there's huge opportunity for technology to make a difference. But at the very same time, there's also great risk that technology makes us more superficial, learners and users of our skills. Now, once again, reading is a prime example. In the past, you had to navigate very complex information. You had to, sift through vast amounts of material. Today, you can just, ask ChatGPT and they throw an answer at you and you just need to extract that information. So yeah, there's a risk that technology will make us lose skills that are particularly important today. Now, in the Google times, you still needed to, you got a lot of answers to your question. You still needed to evaluate, what's relevant, what's not, what's right, what's wrong. In the times of ChatGPT, that's gone, basically. You just have, one answer to your question. And I do think there's a great risk that we might lose some of the reading skills that are particularly important in the digital world. And I think that's something that I think is not answered, whether technology, has the potential to help us, but it could also get in the way and making us more passive consumers rather than active readers.
Thank you for that. Very interesting indeed. And the last one for you, it's fairly direct. Monica Lango asks, what are the top 5 skills for adults above the age of 50, which might be particularly relevant to some members of our audience, not all of them. If you were to name 5, Andreas, what would you say are the top 5 skills for adults above the age of 50? I suppose it depends really on what you're doing, but what would you say?
I mean, that's actually a question that cannot be answered by means of the survey. The survey only looked at a very small basket of skills. But next year, we're going to put out a report on the social and emotional skills of people, widening the range of skills that we cover. And I think we're going to be in a much better position to look at those kinds of issues then, looking at how those kinds of broader ranges of skills relate to economic, social, and civic outcomes, because that's the ultimate question. What are the skills that enable us to make a difference in our societies, in our communities, in our economies?
There you have it. So look out for that in the months ahead. Thank you so much to Andreas for his time. Apologies for the technical problems, which we had earlier on during this webinar, but we got through it. And that was largely down to all your excellent questions as well. So thank you to all of you for contributing. If you want to check out the full report, it is, of course, on the OECD website. You'll have seen the links in the chat as well, where you've got the insights interpretations report, you've got newsletters, you've got the main report. So you've got loads of information to go through. Check out all the charts and graphs and data to your heart's content. That, though, for now is it. Thanks to the team behind the scenes for all their help in organizing this webinar, and hope to see you again at another webinar soon. All the best.